Hello. I'm officially kicking off the August 2nd meeting of Gamma. Thank you to everyone who is here synchronously, as well as anybody who is happens to be watching this online. I am going to go ahead and share my screen as soon as I can pull up the meeting notes. Here we go. And my browser is being weird. Give me one moment here. There we go. So I'm going to share this. Can everyone see that? See my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, we've got several new folks here from the who weren't in the previous meeting, who are now in this meeting, and that's really exciting. It's nice that folks are seem to be finding this split time format useful. So really appreciate the attendance of everyone here. I want to kind of start off by saying that the goal for this split meeting time is to still treat this as one meeting and to continue making forward progress. So I won't be kind of going in depth on the previous things we discussed. We've got really good meeting notes that go through what we discussed, and there's also the recording on the YouTube SIG Network Gateway API playlist as well, if you want to see what we talked about in detail. Because of the number of people who are here and the spirited discussion that's already started happening, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the agenda. John, I think I saw you here. Yeah, there you are. You added a new terminology section to the exploration doc that I think is very useful. Do you want to kind of briefly go through, and I can pull it up on my screen here. Do you want to kind of go through some of the some of the takeaways and definitions here and discuss this terminology and the rationale behind it, perhaps?
Yeah. So last week, if you guys remember, there was some discussion that like we were kind of jumping in without knowing what we were actually doing. So I took the time to kind of give some high-level definitions of things that we're talking about. I'm not here to define what service mesh is. This is just like, this is what it means for the context of what we're trying to do. Everyone has their own ideas. You can go read 100 blogs about it. But at its core, like for what we're trying to do with the API, a service mesh is really just something that is doing things to requests within a cluster, network traffic, right? So it's a very broad definition, which is intentional because we don't need to constrain it to say like, oh, service mesh is something that puts a sidecar envoy proxy next to all pods, right? That's way too narrow for what we're trying to do at the API level. The important part really is just that, you know, you can modify requests and do things like routing, potentially in the future authorization policies, you know, that type of thing. So one thing that was described for Ingress was that it was something that translates things from without context, so like outside the cluster, to things with context inside the cluster. And so a parallel definition for this would be that a service mesh is something that uses the context of the cluster to modify network requests in the cluster. If that helps make sense of it. If not, use the other definition. Does that make sense? Should I move on? If you have questions, just raise your hand. So policy is another big term. This was kind of defined in the GEP I linked here, but policy is also pretty broad in just that it is a resource that attaches to other resources. So that could be attaching to a route, a workload, the entire cluster. It's pretty broad and defined in the GEP kind of how that works. And these are all kind of extension points. So there's no core policies, at least today, in the API, but you could imagine someone making a timeout policy or something for their product, or an authorization policy. So this kind of is closely related to routes, which are, I'd like to define as policy, but everyone in the doc said that was terrible. So I removed that. But routes are kind of, they're not policy, I guess, but they are a similar concept where you're attaching them to things and they modify requests, but they do it by routing generally. And so this doc is focusing right now on routing because I think it will provide a common core for all of the mesh stuff. But in the future and possibly in parallel, I definitely think Gamma will start looking at policy, possibly into defining some shared policies between all the meshes. Like authorization policy, for example, is something that's huge to meshes generally. That would be something that we may look into in the future. Cool. Next is service. I think this is the most important one. So service is kind of overloaded because sometimes people are referring to service as a concept and sometimes service as the Kubernetes resource. In this doc, I try to distinguish them with by code font and capitalization, but if I miss something, feel free to add a comment. Yeah, go ahead, Flynn.
I think I'd like to propose that we use workload to talk about the running instantiation of things that are providing a given service and try to leave service more to refer to the Kubernetes resource. We already seem to use workload a fair amount in mesh land, and the massive overloading of the term service has already been a topic of some discussion.
I agree that using workload to describe workloads is a good term, and we should probably add that as a terminology, but I'm not sure that service and workload are the same thing. And maybe I will go through what I was on the service and then circle back on that and see if there's disagreement there. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I'll echo that workload should describe workload. I do feel like there's a distinction between the actual compute that's running and the way that that compute is accessed. And I think, I'll let you keep going, John, because I think you get into that with front ends and back ends.
Yeah. So I think one of the confusions with service is that I think there's two parts of a service, and in Kubernetes, those are represented with one resource. But when we start looking into mesh, it ends up being important to separate those. So, users may see there's just this thing called a service, but in reality, at least how I like to think about it, is that there's the front end portion and the back end portion. So the front end is like how you actually connect to the service, right? So that could be cluster IP, for example. That could also be the host name that with Kubernetes service, you get auto allocated. And your service may not actually have a front end at all. For example, a headless service doesn't have either of those allocated. The other part is kind of the service backend. So this is kind of a bag of endpoints or a collection of workloads, so to speak, which is why I was saying that I did not necessarily agree that it was a workload, because I view it as a collection of workloads, like a grouping. So in standard Kubernetes, the service backends are endpoints or endpoint slices. In the API today, service, as far as I know, is only used as a backend. So this is an example of some setup where we have a gateway and a route. The route is actually going to refer to a service in a backend ref, which is very well named for this slide. So we're not typically accessing the service through the front end in this case, right? Like the gateway itself is load balancing across the endpoints as part of the service backend. So we're really only using service to refer to this grouping of endpoints that we're going to send traffic to. Now, in the mesh world, I think we often do want to use, and this is maybe controversial going into the actual design, but I think there's at least, hypothetically, we may want to use the service front end as well. So if you scroll down a bit, we show some example of a use case where we want to split in the service A into and do like some load balancing between AV1 and AV2. So in this case, we may actually want to attach a route to the front end of service A, and then in the backend refs for that route, point to AV1 backends and AV2 backends. And so what this would mean is that it's kind of saying when a user calls service A, front end, actually take their request and route it to these two different backends, and presumably some waiting or canarying, something like that. So that was a lot. So I think there'll be questions, especially Flynn. I'm curious what you think on the workload stuff.
Mostly, I think I was noticing that the terminology section did not define workload. And I think that the distinction between the running compute and everything else is important. now I'm kind of thinking about whether there's a way we can define the front end and the back end without kind of overloading service there as well, if we think that the mesh really needs to view those as first class things. Let me think about that a little bit more.
I think this is good. The thing with mesh is that the definitions of the backends are not defined in the service resource a lot of times, right? You're creating arbitrary slices of workloads or endpoints. So I think that having these, at least in the design phase, having that front end back end split elevated as first order ideas is useful for design. And I have my other question in chat, but I think, John, you just addressed it.
Okay, so I definitely add workload here. Any other discussion on this area?
How common do we think it is if you, sorry, can you scroll that up a little bit so we can look at that whole diagram? How common do we think it is for that first service A backend to be completely ignored once a route is in play? So it's interesting to me that you're showing the route ignoring the existing service A backend instead of service AV1, service AV2. And is that intentional? Reflecting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Like, there's largely two cases for why you want to attach a route type object in a mesh, right? One case is I want to apply policies of various sorts. So I can use a concrete example just because I'm familiar with it. In Istio, we have a virtual service, and that's effectively routes and policies combined.
Right.
And so, for example, say I want to add a timeout to my service. I would create a virtual service, and I would say, okay, match the service A front end, add this timeout, and then send to the service A back end, right?
Right.
And so that's really just modifying requests. It's not actually doing any routing. The other case is actually doing routing. Like, I want to take a request to the service and send it somewhere else. I think this is like kind of the bread and butter canary use case right here. Now, in this particular case, the AV1 and AV2 backends are probably subsets of the A backend, right?
Right.
They could also be like A in cluster and A on-prem, like some external cluster or something. But it largely, like, they're still routing to different groups of things, right?
I think this is also one of the things. It's like kind of an unfortunate consequence of the Kubernetes service object being so overloaded, in that maybe it would be cleaner to have that separation of a front end interface with service A backend as a separate box that it points to, as opposed to the route kind of being an abstraction to different backends there.
And this is also kind of one of the reasons where Gateway API and Gamma APIs need to kind of put together to define a canary with a Gamma API. Presumably, the gateway should also respect it and obey the same rules. So you should not have different behavior based on if you're coming from an external address or if you're coming from an internal address.
Rob, do you want to expand on that question from the chat a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just really thinking of, maybe I'm just stuck in Istio land or OpenShift router, right? Those kinds of technologies in the ingress are deciding what workload to send the traffic to. And, from the Istio aspect, right, you've got currently you have things like destination rule where users can configure either connection pooling or load balancing rules for how things might work. I think if you were looking at, Envoy maybe more directly, maybe you've got things that are doing more specific load balancing rules in their cluster load assignment. So I was just, if we're looking at, distinguishing between cluster IP and actual, pod IPs for the routing rules, and just trying to understand better, both the use cases and how that might look.
Yeah, I certainly think that they're falling to buckets. So one of the appeal for mesh for a lot of users is I can keep, for example, I've done this with Istio in the past. I can keep all of my traffic within the same AZ it originates, because on the proxy Envoy in the Istio case is using the Kubernetes topology information to make that determination. That kind of advanced load balancing is not possible with the native Kubernetes service resource, because there is no such, I mean, technically the service references endpoints, but kubeproxy is not doing that kind of that kind of determination on each request. You don't have, there's no hooks into kubeproxy to change that behavior. Your proxy has to do that. And a lot of times that's better because you get observability and all these classic mesh things. And so I really do think it makes sense to, again, at least at a conceptual level, distinguish between the two, because when it comes to mesh implementations, we're often adding metadata, adding context really to the actual workloads or endpoints, or I like the backends. You always use that term. You're adding the context to the backends that are receiving that traffic in order to add really arbitrary, depending on your proxy implementation, you're adding arbitrary groupings based on context available to you. And Kubernetes service doesn't really provide that by default.
That distinction with advanced load balancing is also relevant on the Ingress side, where if you use kubeproxy, then only some things are available. But even for an Ingress, if you go directly to the endpoints, then you can do much more advanced stuff.
But with all the policies and load balancing, that's very useful. But let's not forget that everything starts with an application making the HTTP request, for example, to a particular service.namespace, which must be resolved by DNS because that's how HTTP is implemented, and must resolve to a cluster VIP because that's what Kubernetes returns. So even if all those things happen behind the scene or other advanced things happen, ultimately from a user perspective, they see a DNS name, a VIP, and then from that, other things, load balancing, other things happen. Security, other things are derived. But we cannot ignore the front end, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I feel like the service front end concept captures that. Do you feel like something is missing there, Costin?
No. I just want to make sure that people understand that the front end is kind of cornerstone. I mean, that's what users interact with, that's what users see. How it's implemented, that we can tweak, but we cannot avoid that.
Yeah.
And gateway and mesh are in the same situation. Both of them, are dependent on those things.
Really good discussion so far. Are there any other comments or questions around this front end back end section?
I just want to point out, if you want to use I really like the existing gateway model. So you have different role. So if you do want to have a service front end, you could use the listener sections in the gateway, to specify how do you get to your service. And the HTTP route really is a complete owned by service team, which you can define all the policy, how do you want to route to the backend. Just want to point that out. You could call gateway a different object, mesh object, but I do think it has enough information today to get to different kind of service.
All right. John, did you cover the producer consumer
No,
section?
I can start on there. So producer and consumer are kind of two words that we have been using to almost refer to like not concrete things, but more personas. So the producer is someone that authors or operates a service. So this may be someone that creates a deployment in a service for their workload. They maybe then set up some authorization policies. Maybe they set up routing rules to handle like canaries or whatever. So this is really the person that's actually running a service. We may also say the producer workload, the producer service, producer rule. Like this is all referring to the producer things. The service consumer on the other side is someone that's actually utilizing those services by calling it. So they may do something like curl hello world. So they are consuming the hello world service. And so the important part about the split is that these are kind of different roles and possibly in different trust boundaries, right? And so in the Gateway API for Ingress, we talked a lot about cross namespace boundaries and how we need reference grants to trust those and that type of thing. This is a very, very related concept, right? If the consumer and producer are in different namespaces, they very likely do not want to have one person's resources impact the others in an unexpected way, right? For example, if a consumer created a rule for the hello world that said like add a timeout for 5 seconds, it may be okay if that applies for their own request to that service, but if that applied somehow to like the entire mesh or something, that would probably be a clear violation of this trust boundary, right? So that is producer and consumer. I think that's the last term here as well. I guess I would like to say in general, like any questions here, but also if there's anything that was missed, if there's any words that had ambiguity or you didn't understand other than workload, let me know and I will take a stab at adding those.
Yes, please feel free to add comments or suggestions in the doc directly.
I really like having the terminology section there. I think that's going to be a big help.
Me too. Thank you for putting the work in, John.
Big +1 for me as well. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments on the terminology section, we can move on to our some of our other agenda items. Okay, I just kind of wanted to put this bug in folks' ear since this is the second meeting, and I'll bring this up again at our meeting next week. I wanted to talk through the process, and Shane, I'm glad that you're here because this kind of came from you. But I want to talk about the idea of maybe creating high-level gaps, similar to the gap that's in the issue for the backend resource for mesh representation and service binding. As I kind of mentioned in our meeting last time, some of these like discussing some of these topics in Google Docs is it can be difficult to follow, and it's not the best for preserving conversation or discussing. So I want to suggest to see how folks feel about carving out 2 gaps at a high level, discuss the what and not the how, as far as service binding and mesh representation, and continuing discussion there. Again, not on how we go about it. I'm not going to get into any of the options, but discuss, what are we seeking to do with service binding and mesh representation? What do we want our initial scope to be for those tasks and those items? Referencing some of these slides from the PowerPoint that I did last week, and have discussion ensue there, so we can start breaking this out and get out of this singular doc, referring to it where necessary. I want to turn that over to everybody on the call. What do y'all think about that?
Yeah, that sounds really good to me. The what and the why before the how has, for years of work at different jobs, has always seemed to be the best way to start. You build the consensus about what and why first, because everybody's going to have more. Everybody's going to want to be potentially, unless they're opposed to the what and the why. If you can build that consensus first, The how is usually the most contentious thing, usually. It gets detracting when you're still discussing the what and the why while you're trying to do the how, when the how is the most contentious thing. So I like the approach. Of course, you said that I was the inspiration. That thank you, but but it just seems to make sense to me.
Any other ideas or comments on this?
Big thumbs up to getting away from lots of Google Doc comments.
Yeah, I think just another +1 for you, Keith. I think that the separation between like trying to just separate out like how you talk about like the mesh resources versus the service thing is really good, because I think the service thing for me is the hardest thing to think about right now. So separating those out was wise.
I'm sorry, Shane, which service thing is the service thing here?
Sorry, so in the doc, we talk about service binding, and it sounded like, unless I misunderstood this, Keith, you were planning on having service bind 2 GEPs. One that talked about like how you actually represent the mesh, which is one section in the current Google Doc, and then another GEP that was the service binding, and try to separate those out so that we can get the consensus built around the what and the why for those separately. Is that accurate?
Exactly. Yeah, that's accurate, and that's also that interacts with the exact reason I wanted to split those out, because it's difficult to kind of follow along in a giant doc for this.
Yeah,
so having different histories for both, it'd be great.
Yeah, cool. So all I was saying was that's wise. Good job. That +1.
Do you want to break it in service front-end binding and service back-end binding? Since we talked about it.
Can you repeat that? I didn't catch all of that.
So we discussed about front end and the services, the front end and the back end. Mm-hmm. We want a service back binding for what? For front end, for back end, both separate. We want to, create something that emphasizes a distinction.
Yeah, good question. I think that I'm going to err on the side of not trying to guide discussion here in this venue. I want to create a GEP for that discussion, linked to those definitions for service front end, or just for front end and back end. And then, again, not discussing how we represent things, but have the GEP discuss maybe the need or the scope for representing what we want to represent with this model for service binding. So to answer your question, I'm punting. I'm going to punt that discussion until the GEP.
Yeah, that could take up the whole meeting.
Okay, well, if anybody has any objections, feel free to add a comment to that in our agenda. But I will get started creating those issues, and we can hopefully start working in parallel on that. I'm sure folks have strong opinions on both, so that'll give us a good venue to have those discussions.
Also, I'd like to just, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Just real quick, remind everyone with the GET process, because the GET process, we've had a couple of bad, like swampy PRs that were GEPs. When something is status provisional, if you can, unless you have really, really strong reasons not to, try to err on the side of letting it go through. Like you can become a stakeholder in that. We can make you somebody that needs to be involved for the eventual move to implementable. But it can get really swampy if we're thinking this PR is the complete end. And sometimes it can be really helpful to remind yourself that, like, okay, there's this one bit that I don't super like, but we're really close. Let's merge it. I can actually follow up with my own PR to iterate on this GEP. And that's how it ideally should work, is that, like, that we suss out a lot of things, but when it gets to kind of the edges of things, ideally we would kind of allow ourselves to default to merging and then iterating on that, as opposed to trying to get it all done in one PR. Just a thought. It's again, it's not a hard or fast rule or anything like that.
No, I'd echo exactly what you're saying, Shane, and I'd add that in each one of these provisional GEPs, you can add criteria for what it takes to move from provisional to implementable. So you can say, well, here are all the outstanding things we need to solve before we mark this as implementable. And if we get consensus on that, not what the solutions are, just these are the problems we still have, I think that's a good place to merge.
Awesome. Okay, if there's nothing else there, then Shane, you had the last agenda item on your thoughts around the gateway API resources for mesh and whether or not there's a fit there. You want to reintroduce that?
Yeah, these aren't my words exactly, so just I'm gonna paraphrase a little bit, but I do appreciate somebody writing it down and putting me on the board there. This
is me trying to capture a little bit of the.
No, I appreciate it. It's close. It's. I do not have a good reason to like stop the mesh initiative. So just to throw that out there at all. In fact, I'm eager and actually really wanted to be a part of this initiative, and I actually want to contribute to the parts that are mesh. I work on mesh, and this is important to me. So all that kind of just as the basis for this. It has occurred to me that we should be ready for the possibility that we don't do this in Gateway API. Like, at the very least, be thinking about it. Like, so like right as it stands right now, I think the gap, I can see the gap that's going to come for like how we declare a mesh as being relatively uncontroversial. And what I've seen in the document so far, I like. It's kind of like, you know, from the user perspective, just say, I need a mesh. And then, you know, you go and you provision your Istio or your Kuma or whatever you have, your Linkerd. That's all great. Maybe, you know, I don't know. I think it's going to be less contentious than the service binding section. And there's some things that just don't seem like right now to me don't look like a straight fit. There's this, like, we even have examples in the service binding section right now where we would have like, you know, multiple connections. Like we would basically have like bridge APIs to service an HTTP route and stuff like that. And it just doesn't feel right yet. Now I'm very ready to be convinced that we can make it feel right. And that's part of what we're doing right now. But suffice to say, I just wanted to throw out the call out the idea that, like, you know, don't marry yourselves completely to the idea that we would do this, because it actually might be better for everyone if this were a separate API. We have to continue to think about that as we go forward. We can't get tunnel vision. That's all. But on the other hand, it very well may work. So I don't know. I don't want to say too much more than that, because I feel like I sound like a detractor, and I'm not really. So.
Yeah, I hear your concerns, and I think they're valid. I would give a kind of devil's advocate, I suppose, that I think like they may not fit perfectly today. That's true, and like we're trying to find out what the right fit is. But I think it actually, if we look at the user perspective, it is very advantageous to have the same APIs shared between mesh and gateway for much of the same reasons why the gateway API exists at all, right? It's useful to have the API shared between Nginx and Kong or whatever, right? So if we look from that perspective, I think it's very, very, I mean, I don't want to shoehorn too much if it somehow doesn't work out, but I would be very disappointed if we somehow could not use the same APIs between them, right? So I think it should be a strong goal of this group to find a way to make it fit. Now, you know, things could happen certainly, but that is like a huge benefit, especially with things like, I don't know, Flagger or other integrations, right? To have that just one API that's common between all meshes and Ingress, like that is hugely powerful. You can define your canary one time in one way with one API and have it kind of universal.
That sounds good. I mean, it sounds good, but I also have like some, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Were you ready to?
No, I was done.
Okay. It sounds good, like it does on paper. In practice, I'm not going to date myself, but over a long time of experience, I found that more APIs tends to be, not always, but tends to be better than bigger APIs. Just in general, for maintenance and for user experience. That's been my experience over like most of a decade. So that said, and I'm not trying to like bind us with that. That said, I do have like this back of my head kind of caution about overloading APIs. But I also have the other point that you made, like Gateway API centered around the gateway right now. And I'm not saying we can't change that actually, but it is very centered around the gateway. And some of the like stuff that we have in the doc right now that suggests that we would actually use the gateway as part of the mesh really seems frictional to me. Like what a mesh is and what a gateway is are very different. I mean, end of the day, but having gateways in a mesh, which was one of the things that was suggested. So like, I don't know, as like a representative of the sidecar, that's not even necessarily going to work in all cases. So you have like Cilium mesh, which actually uses eBPF, and it's expressed, and basically you would probably express that entirely through like routing semantics, as opposed to saying there's a gateway that you attach your routing semantics to, because at the end of the day, it's just setting up routes in the Linux kernel with eBPF, right? So there's friction there, I think, with using gateway, and the lack of like me feeling like gateway itself is really compatible is part of what kind of makes me. I'm in this like lurking mode where I'm waiting for like everything to kind of flesh out a little bit, because it doesn't feel right yet, but I also don't have anything specifically against it. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with anyone else, or does that just everybody else kind of like, no, dude?
I understand your concern, but I do want to make sure that we give folks, we got about 20 minutes, to make sure folks have time to get their voices based on the raise hands. So we're going to go down the stack. Thanks for that, Mike, starting with Flynn.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to.
Oh, sorry. I meant to say Flynn, not Lynn.
Flynn, I'm sorry. I caught it wrong. Go ahead, Flynn.
I got you all now.
That happened at least once on the last call too, where somebody said Lynn and I thought it was me. So you're all good. Shane, I think the caution makes a lot of sense. I also kind of find myself agreeing a lot with what John was saying, where it's difficult for me to see that it would be terribly advantageous for the user to have, for example, two different things to talk about HTTP routing that were almost the same but not quite, just as an example. Or, you know, that sort of thing is where I find myself wondering about the UX. What I was going to ask all the way at the beginning of this call, when we were talking about this a little bit before the recording started, was, you know, and you may have answered this already by saying you don't necessarily have good specifics, but yeah, do you have any particular use cases that come to mind that worry you, or ideas about, other than the worries about the gateway fitting in, because obviously we would need a way to have a gateway be present in interacting with a mesh in some fashion, right? Does anything else come to mind there where you feel like, you know, you're already particularly feeling like the users would be better served by two different things?
Well, I can say that, so the two sections, mesh versus like service binding, in mesh, I already gravitate towards having mesh types. I do, that's my bias so far. And I think that makes sense, partially because of what I said. With HTTP route, I get that that's where we want, I mean, HTTP route right now is the lightning rod for everything that we're trying to do, right?
In a lot of ways, yeah.
But I don't feel yet, and again, this is all about me trying to keep my mind open, because I want somebody to persuade me. I want to be persuaded. I don't feel like any of the suggestions that we have for HTTP route and how we would kind of reuse it feel right to me from a user experience standpoint. Like, what I really want, and actually this isn't exactly answering your question, except to say that HTTP route doesn't feel like a shoe-in to me yet. I would really like to see some kind of like a kubectl mockup of how a user is going to deploy a mesh and then start connecting these routes. Like, I would love to see like a fake documentation that says like kubectl apply, and then here you can see like some fake output of like the status of things, and like making like that kind of workflow might help me a lot to start thinking more, like to get the juices flowing a little bit more, like the creativity flowing, so that even I might be able to contribute more to this. Because right now, like I said, I'm mostly just kind of waiting to hear what others have to say. But that's not even clear to me right now, given what we have in the doc. Like, I don't know how I would, at least using what we already have, it doesn't feel like a really good user story. Or
I actually like the kube control mockup enough. I like that idea enough that I think I'm going to take a stab at that.
That would be cool
before the next time. And yeah, you know, it may turn out that we take a stab at it and then come back and go, yeah, Shane was right. This isn't going to work at all. But, you know, we'll see. It'll be a good exercise, right?
Ideally, I'm wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, but I think it's a really good idea to try to take a crack at that and try to establish whether it's going to work or whether it's not going to work. Try to come up with something early rather than waiting until later in the game.
I appreciate you putting attention on that.
If I could jump in, on the doc, there is an example section that at least was intended to be exactly what you described. So if you don't think it's how you envisioned it or in depth enough, I would definitely start there.
I will definitely start by looking at that.
Okay, let's try to keep it. Yes, Alex, thank you.
Yes. So for me, what kind of Gateway kind of was really interested for is kind of to have a split between kind of cluster operators and application developers. And that was why I'm kind of wanted to see what this is all about, because we want to actually, for most of the application developers, we want to hide any aspects of the mesh at all, because it was kind of now a mess with managing virtual service. We're using Istio, and Gateway would be a clear answer for that. And I just want to make sure that kind of, if you think about getting reintroduced mesh topics, that you still have that separation of focus towards the cluster and application developers. Because in general, application kind of people get like their microservice, they know what their route is, but for the rest, they just don't care.
That's a really good point that I had not been thinking about at all, actually. I think, is it fair to say that, like, so just to make sure I'm understanding what you said, to paraphrase it, the abstraction for the developer is really important. And if I'm not mistaken, we don't really have a ton of that right now. There's a lot of decoration that we have in the current models that, you know, you'd have to kind of know that you're in a mesh, and you're suggesting that we should try to add more, as much abstraction as we can, to get as close to, you don't have to think about the fact that you're in a mesh when you express your routes. Does that sound right?
Yeah. That's what we're now trying to do when we go to the Gateway API in our deployment. So developers only need to have like HTTP route. That's my route, and how it gets connected to the rest, to the outside world, that's somebody else's business.
Yep. Big plus one to that. The application devs really don't want to be thinking about anything beyond just, here's a chunk of the URL space, get it to me.
Because introducing kind of mesh concepts to application developers got us really kind of in a mesh, because they kind of sometimes kind of, oh, we can use this and this and this and this. And this sometimes gets very dangerous, certainly have like very large deployments.
Plus one for me too. I hadn't really been thinking about this enough. I think a good action item, actually, Keith, you might want to consider this being a specific motivation in the bullet points on your GET, on at least the service binding one, because that's where this is going to be the most affected, right? Like, or where developers will be kind of required to hopefully not have to do a whole lot.
I agree.
I think I agree with you partially, and I disagree with you partially, of course. Having separate APIs and because a mesh and gateway are a set of policies. Each of them is, you can think of it as a distinct API that is focused for something. HTTP routes more routing stuff. RBAC will attach policies and have timeout policies and so forth. I agree with you that we should focus on each API individually without caring if it's coming from the internet or if it's coming from another service, another workload in the same cluster. So routing is the same. It's not really a distinct if you are ingress gateway or egress gateway or in cluster services, you're still routing. So from this point of view, I agree with you that we should not focus on the gateway as a whole. But I think that the way the gateway API is specified today, it's not about ingress. It's more about attaching policies. It's the cornerstone is the policy attachments, defining the relations between namespaces, how to close down space boundaries. The fact that the route is attached to a gateway, it's an accident. It's not necessarily that the route must attach to an ingress gateway, that it's actually a load balancer, external, and so forth. It just defines how things are routed and could be attached to workload, could be attached to anything, and it can be different in kernel as well. So maybe somewhere in the middle where we treat each policy as an individual policy that applies independent of where its request is coming from, and at the same time we kind of break down the gateway API from the strong attachment to the gateway functions.
Costin, there was some stuff in there that I at least had a really hard time hearing. Just to make certain, are you saying that you think it's important not to overly focus on the mechanisms of attachments between things, or did I hear that completely backwards?
Probably. So not to focus on reinventing how we attach, because the gateway API defines relatively good way to attach things to other things, and different good policies to cross namespace boundaries, and that's really important. So probably we don't need to reinvent them, but each policy individually should not be how does it apply to an ingress gateway. It should be considered independent. So a route, it's a route. You route to an egress, you route to from internet to the cluster, or within the cluster, it's still a single policy to route.
Okay, I think I agree with that.
I think I got it that time. I think you're saying that. I think I heard. Don't reinvent the wheel in terms of attachment. Do focus on the idea of policies and routings and things like that being composable and not specifically focused on ingress versus mesh. Did I get that right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're at Lynn this time. I'm trying to enunciate here.
If I heard the name right, yeah, thank you guys. I've been patiently waiting here because I don't know if it's okay to chime in with other people raising hands. So a couple of points I want to make. So first of all, I think I personally also struggle with gateway being API for the mesh initially. The main struggle is coming through gateway. When people trying to think about gateway, it's more thinking about north-south traffic. But on the other hand, I actually, once you get through the hurdle of, the gateway API could potentially config with mesh, I start to think, it needs to be the same, because I really want to reuse my policies. I really potentially even want to reuse my routes from north-south to east-west traffic without recreating everything new. So I think the hurdle is there, but once you get through, it's just start to make sense to me. So that's one thing I want to share. The second thing I want to share, I think was Alex was mentioning the split between operator and application developers. I think the model that John laid out with policy is really going to help with that, because I can envision, the operator providing policies for everybody to use. And then the developer can easily just opt in to say, this is the retry, this is the timeout policy I want to apply for my service. So it really enables the developers that doesn't have to learn anything other than maybe just create the routes for their services.
I completely agree with that. And Costin made the point in the chat about the cool thing about the policy attachment mechanism in Gateway API is this whole idea of overriding default policies, which I think is going to be really powerful for the scenario you just laid out. So big +1 there.
Cool. John, I think you're next.
If I have a hand, I think that's old.
Okay. Flynn, are you back on the stat?
I am. I raised my hand originally about the separation of roles and separation of concerns with roles. Some of that is what Lynn just pointed out. Lynn, not Flynn. But I actually also wanted to, okay, on the one hand, I wanted to emphasize that it has definitely been extremely powerful in my experience to think hard about the separation of concerns and the separation of roles, in particular between a busy applications developer and somebody working on the platform or somebody working at the cluster level, where the application developer really and truly does not want to think about anything other than solving their business problems. And things like, you know, oh, I don't know, messing with creating a ticket with the ops people to go and define a route to get their traffic in is just pure friction that they're never, ever going to want to spend attention on. In the case of the mesh, I think it's also kind of interesting that I think there's an interesting distinction between the cluster operator, maybe, the cluster provider, and the mesh operator, where I don't think those are necessarily going to be the same person or the same role. And it's very easy for me to imagine somebody who wants to operate a mesh and provide a bunch of tools for their developers to use, but is not the cluster provider. Where a good example of this might be the platform engineering team at a startup that's using Google to, you know, they're going to go off and create a GKE cluster, and then they want to think about installing a mesh on it and defining a bunch of stuff, but they're not the people over at GKE, in the GKE world, who are worried about creating that cluster for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I used to work at a cloud provider. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And I think that distinction is important to remember. Sometimes people would want to use the Gateway API to define a mesh and talk about policies, but they really don't want to be the one who's worrying about, you know, going through and creating the cluster itself from whole cloth and you know, all of that stuff.
So I do agree with that distinction. For me, typically when I read the docs around those personas, I tend to interpret cluster operator as the person with admin permissions who are provisioning like Prometheus and things like that. But maybe that's just my reading of that persona. Maybe that terminology, maybe it's like cluster admin is perhaps a better term to describe what you're talking about.
I would feel better about that, yeah.
But the gateway API docs do specify like cluster operator, and that's I think how it's described in the docs. So that's why I actually use that terminology as well.
Yeah.
So maybe that should then actually change as well.
It's an interesting thing. I think that those three roles are all independent and worth some thinking about. And I think it may also turn out to be worth thinking about it when we start thinking about compliance as well. As we look through some of that, where if I remember correctly, we ran across some stuff with Gateway API compliance in the beginning that almost felt like it was requiring us to work at the level of the cluster provider, even though that wasn't a role that we typically was. I might also be misremembering that, so don't quote that too hard.
Just as a time check, we've got approximately 40 seconds left in our meeting. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and call this. Thank you everybody so much. This was a fantastic discussion. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to take an action item to create GitHub issues on the Gateway API repo for those two gaps, mesh representation and service binding. I look forward to your invigorating discussions and conversation on those issues and maybe even clarifying discussion to GitHub discussions, who knows? Were there any other action items that were captured today that we need to make a note to revisit in our next meeting? Do I remember a action around kind of mocking the interaction with HTTP route?
Yep, you can capture that and put my name on it.
Yep.
Awesome, sounds good. Again, thanks everybody, and looking forward to chatting next week.
Thank you.